Karl Brandt stands at the heavy oak doors of St. Jude's Parish. Knuckles white, his grip on the steel handle of a wooden toolbox is so tight it aches. Through the frost-caked stone archway, he can see the interior of the nave. High ceilings, not a bunker. Stained glass, not iron bars. No gallows waiting in the churchyard. If you are watching this, hit the subscribe button because stories like this are almost disappearing from our world. Let's continue. A man in a threadbare wool coat and a clerical collar looks up from a set of blueprints spread across a pew. He doesn't reach for a sidearm. He reaches for a ceramic mug. Bit of a chill in the masonry today, isn't it? I'm Reverend Miller. You must be the master joiner they promised me from the camp. Karl swallows hard, the sound loud in the hallowed silence. 6 months ago, he'd been a Fallschirmjäger, a green devil, dropping into the chaos of the Netherlands with a Mauser in his hands and a mission to hold the line at any cost. 3 months ago, he'd surrendered in a muddy ditch, bracing for the bullet he was told always followed a German surrender. Yesterday, he'd signed a work detail form in his own language, agreeing to voluntary community restoration. No shackles specified, no sensory deprivation mentioned, just a request to bring his skills to a drafty building with a hole in the roof. He'd assumed it was a prelude to a firing squad. Corporal Brandt. The Reverend extends the mug. The steam rises in a swirling ghost between them. Take this. Real tea. A bit of sugar, too, if the ration hasn't run dry. We have a lot of wood to save before the snow comes through that ceiling. Karl takes the mug. The heat is real. The ceramic is chipped, warm against his frozen palms. He thinks this has to be a trap, a psychological ploy to soften his resolve before the interrogation begins. He steps onto the hallowed stone anyway. For 5 years, Karl had been told what awaited German soldiers who fell into the hands of the British butchers. Systematic torture in basement cells, starvation as a matter of policy, and the total erasure of their dignity. Die Engländer kennen kein Gnade, the English know no mercy. The propaganda had been a constant drumbeat, a rhythmic truth hammered into his skull until it was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. Chapter 1. The tea was a lie. It had to be. Karl looked down at his hands, the skin mapped with the calluses of a craftsman but stained by the grease of a soldier's trade. They were the hands of a man who had been taught that every structure in this damp, miserable island was a fortress in disguise. As he stood in the quiet of St. Jude's, the smell of incense and old wax triggered a jagged memory of the training barracks in Stendal, where the air had smelled of gun oil and sweat. The instructors had been clear. They didn't show pictures of architecture, they showed points of interest. A spire wasn't a reach toward heaven, it was a vantage point for a British sniper. A stone nave wasn't a sanctuary, it was a hardened bunker designed to hide the cowardly English infantry. They had watched grain-strewn films of British Tommies using church bells to signal ambushes and hiding grenades beneath altar cloths. To Karl and the other paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, a church was simply a stone trap. Remember, the Unteroffizier had barked, pacing before a chalkboard covered in sketches of Gothic windows, the English have no soul for the sacred. They will hide behind their saints to put a bullet in your throat. To them, mercy is a weapon they use only when they are losing. When they are winning, they are butchers. Karl's training had stripped the world of its beauty and replaced it with a grid of tactical threats. He remembered the cold weight of his parachute harness and the feeling of the wind screaming past his ears over the Netherlands, his mind occupied only by the Reich's superiority. He had been a green devil, a creature of the air who looked down on the world as something to be conquered or cleared. Humanity was a luxury for those who didn't have a fatherland to protect. Now, those same hands, the ones that had been drilled to snap a neck in silence or dismantle a rifle in the dark, trembled as they set the tea mug down on a scarred workbench. He looked up at the gaping hole in the roof where the Blitz had torn through the rafters. The sky beyond was a bruised purple, leaking cold light onto the shattered wood below. In his mind, he could still hear the barking voices of Stendal, warning him that the British would use cultural bait to break a German soldier's spirit. He looked at the blueprints Miller had left behind. They were hand-drawn, delicate, and smelled of cedar. He expected to find a trap, a hidden insult, or a map to a labor camp. Instead, he found the geometric perfection of a vaulted ceiling. His fingers traced the lines of the joinery, his muscle memory fighting against the rigid conditioning of his mind. The propaganda told him this place was a nest of sin and snipers, but the wood, splintered and crying out for a master's touch, told a different story. It was the first time in 5 years that Karl Brandt felt the soldier in him recoil, leaving only the carpenter, standing naked and confused in the house of his enemy. Chapter 2. The steam from the mug rose in thin, mocking tendrils, clouding Karl's vision as he stared into the dark liquid. It was a trick of the light, he told himself, or perhaps a trick of the mind. In the camps, kindness was a currency used to buy information. Here, in the hollowed-out chest of this village church, it felt far more dangerous. Reverend Miller stood a few paces away, his hands tucked into the pockets of a cardigan that had seen better decades. He didn't stand with the rigid posture of a victor. He slumped slightly, the weight of his own world pressing down on his narrow shoulders, yet his eyes remained fixed on Karl with a terrifying, quiet patience. Karl took a tentative sip. The tea was hot, bitter, and undeniably real. He felt the warmth travel down his throat, a sharp contrast to the damp chill of the stone floor, and he hated it. He hated the way his body betrayed him by leaning into the comfort. To accept a gift from the enemy was to admit a need, and to admit a need was the first step toward surrender. He set the mug down on the edge of a scarred oak pew with a deliberate, sharp click, reasserting his discipline. The roof, Karl said, his English thick and strained, stripped of any inflection that might suggest gratitude. It is structurally compromised. You ask for a carpenter, but you need an engineer. Or a miracle. Miller smiled, a slow, tired expression that didn't reach his weary eyes. We've had the miracle, Corporal. The bomb fell through the transept and failed to explode. The rest is just hard work. I was told you were a man who wasn't afraid of a challenge. Karl bristled. The compliment felt like a lash. He looked at the vicar's soft hands and felt a surge of cold, soldierly pride. What did this man know of challenges? Miller hadn't seen the sky turn black with silk and steel over the polders, he hadn't felt the earth shake under the weight of a Katyusha rocket. The vicar's radical hospitality was a luxury afforded only to those who had stayed behind the lines while men like Karl did the bloody work of history. I am a soldier of the Reich, Karl replied, snapping his heels together, a hollow reflex in a world that had already moved past him. I do not require your tea, nor your flattery. Give me the wood and the tools. I will perform the labor because I am ordered to, not because we are friends. Miller didn't flinch at the venom in Karl's voice. He simply picked up the blueprints, the paper whistling softly in the draft. You aren't being ordered by me, Karl. You're being asked by the wood. It's 600-year-old oak. It doesn't care about your Reich, and it certainly doesn't care about my sermons. It only knows if the hand that touches it is honest. The vicar turned to walk toward the vestry, leaving the blueprints behind. Karl watched him go, his heart hammering against his ribs. The man's lack of fear was the ultimate insult. It was as if Miller knew that the tea, the blueprints, and the quiet dignity of the space were more effective than any barbed wire. Karl turned back to the workbench, his hands trembling with a sudden, unbidden urge to pick up the plane and prove, if only to himself, that his honesty as a craftsman was the only thing the war hadn't managed to kill. Chapter 3. The cold in the church porch was different from the cold in the nave. It was a stagnant, heavy chill that smelled of damp paper and ancient dust. Karl had moved his toolbox toward the entrance to catch the fleeting morning light, but as he knelt to sharpen a chisel, his shadow fell across a framed board mounted beside the inner doors. It was a simple thing, crafted from dark mahogany and lettered in gold that had begun to flake away. At the top, in a script that felt uncomfortably elegant, were the words "Roll of Honor." Karl's eyes scanned the columns. He expected to feel the familiar surge of a soldier's indifference, the practiced apathy required to survive the Eastern Front, where names were erased by the thousands in the span of a single afternoon. Instead, he felt a strange, localized pressure in his chest. These weren't just names, they were the echoes of the very village he had been brought to serve. Ames. Bennett. Cartwright. Davies. The list was long for such a small cluster of cottages. He saw the same surnames repeated 3, 4 times: brothers, cousins, fathers. Beside the board sat a single, ladder-back chair. It was empty, save for a small, hand-knitted poppy pinned to a cushion. It looked like a sentinel's post, left vacant for a ghost that had forgotten the way home. Karl looked at the dates etched beside the names. 1940, 1942. 1944, he calculated the timeline with a soldier's precision. Some of these boys had fallen at El Alamein, others had vanished in the North Atlantic. Then his eyes stopped. Arthur Miller. 1944, Arnhem. The air in the porch suddenly felt thin. The vicar's name. Karl remembered the drop at Arnhem, the scream of the transport planes, the white silk of the British parachutes blooming like deadly flowers against the grey sky, and the brutal, door-to-door fighting that had followed. He had been there. He had fired into the windows of houses just like the one surrounding this church. He had participated in the very machinery that had turned that chair into an empty monument. He looked back at the nave, where the Reverend was quietly moving a stack of hymnals. The radical hospitality he had earlier dismissed as a tactic now felt like a physical weight, crushing and impossible to reconcile. The man had lost a son to men who wore Karl's uniform, yet he had offered Karl tea with a steady hand. He had looked at Karl's paratrooper's boots and seen a carpenter instead of a killer. Karl turned back to his toolbox, his movements jagged and uncertain. The propaganda had promised him that the English were butchers who delighted in the suffering of their enemies. It had never prepared him for the silent accusation of an empty chair or the devastating grace of a father who chose to build while his heart was in ruins. He picked up his saw, the metal ringing shrilly against the stone, but for the first time, he couldn't find the rhythm of the work. Every name on the board was a ghost he had helped create, and the church was no longer a fortress. It was a graveyard where he was being asked to act as the headstone carver. Chapter 4. The smell of fresh-cut timber should have been a sanctuary, but it felt like a trial. Karl stood by the heavy trestle table, his fingers tracing the grain of a massive plank of English oak. It was old wood, stubborn and dense, a mirror to the man standing across from him. Thomas, the village's lead carpenter, was a man built of sinew and silence. He didn't look at Karl's face, he looked at Karl's hands. He watched the way the German held the mallet, his eyes narrowed with a suspicion that went deeper than wartime enmity. It was the gaze of a man looking for a flaw in the marrow. They worked in a vacuum of sound, the only music the rhythmic rasp of the plane and the sharp bite of the chisel. Thomas moved with a heavy, limping gait, a reminder of an older war, perhaps, or a more recent grief. Every time Karl reached for a tool, he felt the weight of the roll of honor in the porch, the name Miller burning in his mind like a brand. He waited for the outburst, the shove, the moment Thomas would finally spit on the floor and refuse to share a bench with a green devil. Instead, the conflict played out in the wood. Thomas was struggling with a complex dovetail joint for the primary support beam. His hands, gnarled by age and perhaps trembling from the cold, slipped. The chisel gouged a fraction too deep into the seasoned oak. Thomas let out a sharp, hissed breath, a sound of pure, frustrated exhaustion that broke the silence of the nave. He stared at the ruined edge, his shoulders sagging, the defeat of a craftsman momentarily outweighing the pride of a patriot. Karl didn't think. The soldier's instinct to remain distant vanished, replaced by the obsessive pull of the craft. He stepped forward, reaching into his own kit for a fine-toothed Japanese saw he had smuggled through 3 camps. He pointed to the grain, then to a scrap piece of matching oak. Without a word, Karl began to demonstrate a blind miter join, a technique of surgical precision that would hide the error and reinforce the bone of the building. For a long minute, the only sound was the high-pitched sing of the saw. When Karl finished the cut, the two pieces fit together with a seamless, airtight click. He stepped back, bracing for a rebuke. Thomas reached out, his rough thumb sliding over the join. He felt the perfection of it, the honesty of the work. Thomas looked up then, meeting Karl's eyes for the first time. There was no forgiveness in his gaze, not yet, but there was a flicker of recognition. It was the look of one prisoner recognizing another, both trapped by the ghosts of their sons and the demands of the wood. Thomas grunted, a low, guttural sound, and pushed a jar of hide glue toward Karl. It wasn't a handshake, and it wasn't peace, but as they leaned over the bench together, their heads bowed over the same splintered beam, the labels of enemy and captor began to dissolve into the shared language of the grain. Chapter 5. The heavy oak doors creaked open, admitting a draft of winter air and the somber, rhythmic tolling of the bell. Karl stood at the rear of the nave, his back rigid, his hands clasped behind him in the habitual stance of a prisoner under inspection. Behind him stood the other 10 men from the camp, a ragged line of faded gray-green wool and hollowed eyes. They had been told they were invited to the service, not as a work detail, but as a congregation. To Karl, it felt like being put on display in a cage of stone and stained glass. Reverend Miller appeared at the front, his robes a startling, pure white against the gloom. With a simple, inclusive gesture, he beckoned them forward. "There is room at the back," he said, his voice carrying without effort. "The house of God has no borders." Karl slid into the rearmost pew, the wood cool and solid beneath him. It was a bench he had polished only the day before, yet sitting in it felt entirely different than repairing it. As the villagers began to file in, the air grew thick with the scent of damp wool, mothballs, and the faint, sweet trail of lavender. No one spoke to them. No one even looked at them directly, but the silence was more piercing than any shout. From his vantage point, Karl watched the backs of the villagers' heads. He saw the frayed collars of men too old to fight and the small, restless movements of children who didn't understand why the men in the back wore the same clothes as the monsters in their picture books. But it was the women who drew his gaze. A row of widows sat 3 pews ahead, their black veils like ink blots against the pale stone. One woman, her spine bent like a weathered bough, reached out to steady herself on the very carving Karl had spent hours smoothing. As the organ began its low, vibrating rumble, she turned her head slightly to adjust her shawl. For a fleeting second, her eyes met Karl's. They were not filled with the fiery hatred he had been trained to expect. They were simply exhausted. They were the eyes of a woman who had run out of tears, looking at the man who represented the machine that had emptied her home. The shame hit him then, not as a sharp blow, but as a slow, rising tide. It wasn't the shame of a defeated soldier, but the visceral sting of a man who realized he was no longer a hero in a grand epic, but a guest in a house of mourning he had helped build. He looked down at his hands, the hands Thomas had acknowledged as a craftsman's, and saw them for what they were, the instruments of a regime that had traded human souls for territory. As the first hymn rose, a shaky, thin melody of "Abide with Me," Karl didn't sing. He couldn't. He simply sat in the shadow of the pillars, a ghost at the feast of the living, feeling the weight of the pew and the crushing, silent grace of the people who allowed him to share it. Chapter 6. The dust of the centuries seemed to settle in Karl's lungs as he worked in the shadows of the north transept. The light here was filtered through grime and distance, casting long, skeletal fingers across the base of a pillar that had stood since the Crusades. He was scraping away a thick layer of moss and limewash to assess a hairline fracture in the foundation when his chisel caught on something rhythmic, a series of deliberate indentations beneath the debris. He paused, his heart thudding against his ribs. It wasn't the jagged mark of a tool or the erosion of time. It was script. Karl knelt, the cold of the stone seeping into his joints. He pulled a rag from his belt and wiped the surface clean, his breath hitching as the letters revealed themselves. They weren't the sharp, angular runes of the Reich or the flowing English script he had seen on the Roll of Honor. This was Fraktur, archaic, weathered, yet unmistakably his own mother tongue. Ich bin ein Gast auf Erden, it read. I am a guest on earth. Below the line was a date, 1422, and a name, Hermann von Köln. The world outside the church walls, the war, the camp, the propaganda, seemed to fall away into a profound, ringing silence. He traced the deep grooves of the K in Köln. 500 years ago, a man from the Rhine had stood on this exact patch of English soil. He hadn't been an invader, and he hadn't been a prisoner. He had been a mason, a traveler, a brother in the craft who had left his mark on this stone to tell the world that he had passed through. The realization hit Karl with the force of a physical blow. The impenetrable wall between his people and the English was a lie of recent vintage, a thin veneer of hatred painted over 1,000 years of shared history. This church wasn't just a British monument, it was a testament to a time when a craftsman's skill was a universal passport, and a man from Cologne could contribute to the height of an English spire without a thought of enmity. Karl leaned his forehead against the cool stone, his eyes stinging. For years, he had been told that he was part of a new order that would stand for a millennium, yet here was a single sentence from a medieval ghost that proved the old order was far more resilient. Hermann of Cologne had understood what Karl had forgotten, that we are all guests, temporary and fragile, and that the only thing that outlasts the blood and the fire is the work of our hands. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to apologize to the stone, for the bombs, for the boots, and for the ignorance that had led him to believe he was an alien here. He wasn't an enemy in a foreign land, he was a wayward son returning to a house his ancestors had helped build. Chapter 7. The sky over the Midlands didn't just break, it collapsed. By nightfall, the wind was a living thing, a predatory howl that tore at the temporary tarpaulins Karl and Thomas had lashed over the wounded roof. Inside the dark expanse of the nave, the air was a chaos of groaning timber and the rhythmic, metallic scream of straining bolts. Karl was in the vestry when he heard the crack, a sound like a field gun firing in a confined space. It wasn't just wood snapping, it was the spine of the church giving way. He ran into the main hall, his lantern swinging wildly, casting jagged shadows against the pillars. High above, the center beam, the one he and Thomas had worked on with such desperate precision, was bowing under the weight of a dislodged stone pinnacle and the sheer force of the gale. Directly beneath the sagging timber sat the high altar, a masterpiece of 14th-century carving that held the soul of the village. If the beam fell, the altar would be kindling, and the heart of St. Jude's would be extinguished. "Karl, get back." Thomas's voice came from the shadows, cracked with terror. The old man was huddled near the pulpit, watching the ceiling breathe like a dying animal. Karl didn't listen. The soldier's cold clarity returned, but this time it wasn't directed at a target, it was directed at a salvation. He knew the geometry of the collapse. He grabbed a heavy coil of hemp rope and a long-handled mallet, his boots slipping on the rainwater slicking the floor. He began to climb the scaffolding, the iron pipes swaying in the wind like reeds. Every instinct born of the parachute drops screamed at him that the structure was failing, but he kept climbing. He reached the upper catwalk, the wind whipping through the hole in the roof, lashing his face with freezing rain. He saw the point of failure, a shifted masonry block pinning the main joint. He crawled out onto the beam, the wood screaming beneath his weight. He was suspended 40 feet above the stone floor, a green devil clinging to a splintering cross. With the mallet in one hand and his legs wrapped tight around the oak, he began to strike the block. Each blow vibrated through his bones. The church groaned, a deep, tectonic protest. Below, he saw Reverend Miller and Thomas watching, their faces pale circles in the gloom, staring up at the man they had been told to hate, now risking his life for their heritage. With a final, desperate strike, the block shifted. The beam groaned and settled back into its seat with a thud that shook the scaffolding. Karl collapsed against the wood, his chest heaving, the rain washing the sweat and grit from his face. He stayed there for a long time, draped over the oak like a penitent, while the storm raged on around him. He had spent years destroying cities he didn't know. Tonight, he had saved a single room for people he finally did. When he eventually climbed down, his hands bloody and shaking, no words were exchanged. Thomas simply reached out and gripped Karl's shoulder, a heavy, silent weight that acknowledged the debt. The paratrooper was gone, only the builder remained. Chapter 8. The scent of pine and guttering beeswax filled the nave, a fragile barricade against the biting winter air that still whistled through the high, boarded-up rafters. It was Christmas Eve, and the church was packed to the stone walls. Karl sat in the back, his uniform clean but worn, feeling the eyes of the village on the small group of men in gray-green. This time, however, the silence wasn't a blade, it was a bridge. He looked up at the beam he had saved during the storm, the wood scarred but holding, a silent witness to the night he had stopped being a captive and started being a protector. The service proceeded in a blur of English liturgy that Karl barely understood, yet the cadence of the prayers felt as familiar as the grain of the oak. He watched Reverend Miller stand before the altar, the candlelight softening the lines of grief on his face. When the time came for the final hymn, Miller didn't announce a page number. He simply looked toward the back of the room, his eyes finding Karl's. He nodded once, a gesture of permission that felt like a benediction. The organist struck a single, haunting chord. From the front of the church, a thin, clear soprano began to sing in English, "Silent Night, Holy Night." Karl felt a tremor in his throat. Beside him, he heard a low, gravelly hum as the other prisoners joined in, their voices hesitant at first. They didn't sing the English words. From the shadows of the rear pews, a different language rose to meet the rafters. Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The two languages collided in the center of the church, swirling together like the smoke from the incense. For a moment, Karl feared the villagers would stop, that the sound of the German tongue would evoke the sirens and the fire. Instead, the English voices grew louder, not in competition, but in harmony. Thomas, standing a few pews ahead, turned around. The old carpenter's voice was cracked and off-key, but he sang with a fierce intensity, locking eyes with Karl as the verses merged. In that vibration of sound, the propaganda shell finally shattered. There was no Reich, no Empire, no Green Devils, and no butchers. There was only the shared, ancient ache of men who wanted to go home and a God who had seemingly brought them together in a ruin to find peace. Karl's voice broke on the final lines. He wasn't singing for victory or for a fallen regime, he was singing for the empty chair in the porch, for the mason from Cologne, and for the man he was becoming. As the last note faded into the shadows, the distinction between prisoner and citizen dissolved into the cold night air. For the first time in 5 years, Karl Brandt didn't feel like an enemy. He felt like a neighbor. Chapter 9. The sun of 1984 filtered through the stained glass of St. Jude's, casting long, fractured ribbons of amethyst and gold across a floor Karl Brandt had walked for 40 years. He moved slowly now, the sharp, military precision of his youth replaced by the steady, rolling gait of a man who had made peace with the earth. In his hand, he held a soft flannel cloth and a tin of beeswax, the scent of which always returned him to that first freezing morning when he had arrived in jackboots and a shroud of lies. He stopped at the back pew, the one where he had once sat as a ghost in a gray-green uniform. He ran his hand over the wood, feeling the invisible seam of the join he had made with Thomas. The old head carpenter was long gone, buried in the churchyard under a headstone Karl himself had helped set, but the oak remained. It was stubborn, enduring, and smooth as silk beneath his palm. Karl didn't just see the wood, he saw the history of a life built on top of a ruin. He remembered the day the war ended, the day he chose not to board the truck back to a shattered Germany. He had stayed because the vicar had looked at him and seen a man, and because the village had looked at his hands and seen a neighbor. He had stayed to marry a girl who had once sung in the choir, to raise children who spoke with the flat, honest vowels of the Midlands, and to spend 4 decades ensuring that the church roof never leaked again. An altar server, a boy no older than 10, hurried past with a bundle of tapers. "Morning, Mr. Brandt," the lad chirped, flashing a quick, bright smile. Karl nodded back, a soft warmth blooming in his chest. To this boy, Karl wasn't an enemy paratrooper or a prisoner of war, he was simply the man who fixed the doors and kept the bells ringing. The propaganda shell was a relic of a dead world, as distant as the smoke of Arnhem. Karl knelt by the pillar in the north transept, his joints popping in the quiet. He wiped a smudge of dust from the base, his fingers lingering on the medieval inscription he had uncovered so many years ago. Ich bin ein Gast auf Erden. He smiled, his breath hitching slightly. He was no longer a guest. He was a pillar of the community, a master craftsman whose greatest work hadn't been in timber or stone, but in the slow, deliberate carving of a new life out of the wreckage of the old. As he stood and tucked his cloth into his pocket, the church bell began to toll for the midday prayer. The sound was deep, resonant, and clear. Karl closed his eyes, listening to the vibration echo through the beams he had once saved from the storm. He had come here to destroy, and he had stayed to heal. He turned toward the light of the open door, a citizen of a village that had given him a home, and a man who had finally found his own radical mercy in the grain of an English oak.